right, good evening, everyone. Good to see all of you tonight. Hope you're doing well. Last week, when we began this class, we started by introducing the parables and what those are and the teaching style that Jesus uses for the parables and why that's important. And then as we got near to the end of class last week, we started looking at the synoptic problem, which is just a fancy way of saying when Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the same event, why do they sometimes record it differently? And I want to take just a minute and back up a little bit and hit that one more time. I don't want to exhaust everything that we talked about at that point, but I think it's important that you hear that when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write about the same event in different ways, it is actually a blessing. It is a good thing. Now, what some of our atheist friends and maybe some critical scholars will point out is questions about where did they get this information? Why is that information so different? I'll give you just a quick example of this, and we'll see this again here when we look at the parable for our study today. There's only 2 miracles that are recorded in all 4 Gospels. Does anyone know which ones they are? 2 miracles recorded in all 4 Gospels. One is the resurrection of Jesus. The other is the feeding of the 5,000. It's the only 2 miracles that are mentioned in all 4 Gospels. Now, what's interesting is in the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all present the event that leads up to the feeding of the 5,000 differently. In one account, there is the death of John the Baptist. And then after that, you have the feeding of the 5,000. In another account, there is the ministry of the limited commission, as we call it. The apostles and disciples of Jesus coming back from their small missionary trip. The third is the calming of the storm on the sea. Right, so you have all of these different things, all these different events that lead up to the feeding of the 5,000. It's tempting for us to read these and say, well, since they don't align, then one of them must be wrong. What I want us to try to do, and we'll do this tonight, is to say, what is said differently? How do those different pieces fit in together? And what is the main takeaway from the overall statement? Okay, so with the synoptic problem, we mentioned last week that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those are the synoptic Gospels. John's over in left field by himself. John is very frustrating to read alongside the other Gospels because John doesn't write in chronological order. He writes according to themes. He talks about a different timeline. He includes 3 Passovers that Jesus celebrates. Matthew, Mark, and Luke only include 1. Okay, so you have those differences. So when we talk about the synoptic problem, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which by the way, there's no parables in the Gospel of John. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the only place that parables are found. So what is it then that if we compare these side by side, we can mesh together and get a holistic view? Okay, so that in mind, we're going to look at 2 parables that are actually what is called a double parable. A double parable are 2 parables that are mentioned side by side one another with the same intended meaning. So the parables that we have tonight are the parable of the cloth and the wineskin. This is found in Matthew chapter 9, Mark chapter 2, and Luke chapter 5. So it's found in all 3 synoptic Gospels. If you want to turn in your Bibles to one, I would recommend that you turn to Matthew's Gospel. This is Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 through 17. I will have on the screen for us in just a minute the passages from all 3 side by side. Doing that, though, in a chart format makes it very difficult to see. Okay, so some of you may have difficulty seeing the screen. If that's the case, you can look at it in your own Bibles. Okay, double parable. Jesus does this quite frequently. In the ancient world in the first century, if you wanted to get a point across, you did what Mama did when she yelled at you. She would say something twice, right? Actually, if you had my mama, if she had to say something twice, you were in trouble. First time was a charm. But Jesus wanted to get things across, and he told them twice. Do you remember, this is just another example of this, but do you remember when Jesus gave the parable of the prodigal son in Luke's gospel? Yes. He gave two parables prior to the prodigal son, and those were the parables of what? They're two lost things. Lost coin and lost sheep, okay? And then the third we often call the parable of the lost son. Right? So there's this constant giving of the same message with different figures. This is what the parable of the cloth and the wineskin is going to do for us. So Matthew chapter 9, we're going to read all of these, by the way. So again, I don't know if you can see that or not. Maybe you can. I hope you can. Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 through 17 says that then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put on old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." Now, before we move on to Mark's account, you'll notice that as we continue on in Mark and Luke, these get a little more lengthy, right, as far as the wording goes. The message is virtually the same, but we get a couple of differences concerning the occasion. And it's that difference that I want us to pay attention to, because the occasion of the parable will tell us what the parable is trying to accomplish. Right? Again, by way of example, we will have, I promise, an evening where we study the prodigal son. And by that point, we won't need to, because I keep using him as an example. But the prodigal son is told, that parable and the parable of the other two lost things, sheep and coin, are told to the Pharisees, who are upset that Jesus is eating and drinking with sinners. Right? That tells me what I need to know about the overall point of the parable. So what is the occasion of this parable in Matthew's gospel? Well, verse 14 says that the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, and your disciples don't?" Now this is important. Who is it that's asking the question in Matthew's gospel? Not a trick question. The disciples of John. Where is John at this point in Jesus' ministry? He's in jail. He's in jail. Okay. So that's the occasion. Now let's look at Mark's gospel and notice some differences between Matthew and Mark. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came to him and said, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." Now here we have two significant differences between Mark and Matthew's gospel. The first is, who is it that brings forth the question in Mark's gospel? People, right? We do not know who these people are. It's very generic. It's people. But we find out that they bring the question at the time when the disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. But we're not told that the disciples of John are the ones who asked the question. Okay, so there's a little difference between Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel. The other is at the end where Jesus concludes his conversation about the wineskins, and he says, "But the new wine is for fresh wineskins." In Matthew's gospel, it seems like Jesus is saying there is a way to preserve the new wine and the old wineskins. And really it should be the goal to preserve both of these things. In Mark's gospel, that's a little different. Both of them need to be preserved, but new wine is for fresh wineskins. So we get this new caveat that new wine should go into new wineskins. And here in just a minute, we'll look at the historical context and see why that was so important. Now, Mark's gospel, this is heavily debated, but generally it's accepted that Mark's gospel was the first gospel to be written. Matthew then follows, and Matthew used Mark as a source. Luke follows Matthew and Mark and uses both of them as sources. And of course, Luke's gospel tells us in chapter 1 that Luke is a historian and that he did his due diligence and research in order to find out what he needed to record. Okay? Because Luke is not an apostle, right? Luke was not with Jesus in his ministries. Where did Luke get his information from? Primarily. Okay? Who specifically? What other book of our New Testament did Luke write? Acts. Who is the main character of the second part of the book of Acts? Paul. Who is with Paul on his missionary journeys when the author says, "We went here and we did this"? Luke. Luke is with Paul. We call those the we sections of the book of Acts. So where did Luke get his information from? He got it from primarily Paul and the other apostles. And just real quick, this is Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." By the way, who is the book of Acts addressed to? Theophilus, right. We do not know who Theophilus was. He might have been a judge in Paul's court cases, but we don't know. Okay? And then he says, verse 4, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. Now, I bring that up because when we read Luke, Luke is a lot lengthier than Matthew and Mark. And Luke is going to give some different details. So here's what he says. This is Luke 5:33 through 39. "And they said to him, The disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink." Pause. Nowhere in Mark or Matthew is there any mention of prayers. That's only in Luke's gospel. Verse 34, "And Jesus said to them, Can you make a wedding guest fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable." Now, notice in verse 36, Luke says, he also told them a parable. Matthew and Mark do not introduce the parable as something separate. Luke does. This has led some commentators to argue that Jesus' giving of these parables does not fit the occasion of the question that's being asked. Why don't you fast? Now, I don't think we can make that argument because it's right there in the context. And so all we have to do is go with what we have. But he told him a parable. "No one tears a piece of a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine in old wineskins. If he does, new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins." Now, verse 39 is the addition. It's the major addition of Luke that neither Matthew nor Mark include. And it says, "And no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good." So, there we have the three accounts of this double parable in all three synoptic gospels, and we see where there are, I would consider them minor differences. Overall, they're minor differences. But they're differences enough that make us pause and make us think, is there a reason why these differences are there? Now, I mentioned to you last time that when we look at a parable, we're going to do so based on two primary contexts. Okay? The first is the historical, and the second is the literary. So, what would it mean? 'Cause Jesus spoke to people in ways that they could understand, right? Jesus spoke to the common person. And this is one reason why when you read Jesus giving the parables, it's usually the tax collectors and sinners who repent and understand, and it's the Pharisees and the scribes and the people with PhDs in theology who say, "Now wait a minute, I don't understand." Okay. So let's look first at the historical context of this. Here's an example of a garment that would be long around the 1st century, maybe a little bit later, that has a patch. Now you can notice some things about the patch and about the stitch work that went into this garment. First of all, what do you notice about the fact that the garment has a patch in the first place? What does that tell you about the owner of the garment? Yeah, it tells you that the garment still has a value, and I'm not going to throw it away. See, we live today in a very throwaway society. I don't know about y'all, but this used clothing bin back here, Kayla and I have donated quite a lot too. As we do spring cleaning and we go throughout and we figure out we have clothes that we haven't worn in a while, and they're perfectly fine clothes. But then we get rid of them, usually so we can have room for our other stuff, right? Well, in the 1st century world, it wasn't that way. In the 1st century, you kept what you had because these resources, I don't want to say they were limited, but they were less available. Okay. So notice the stitch work on this. Stitch work has been very well done. It goes all the way across and around the edges. Now, here's the problem about a new cloth on an old garment. That new cloth is not malleable. It's not pliable. I don't know about y'all, but growing up, I was allowed to wear one type of blue jean, and it was Wrangler cowboy cut. If you go to Tractor Supply and put on a pair of Wrangler cowboy cut jeans in the dressing room, you don't have to get them starched. They're already stiff. Okay? I mean stiff as a board. Now what would happen if I took a pair of my brand new Wrangler cowboy cut blue jeans and used that to patch a pair of my old blue jeans? Okay, what's the problem with that? Why can't I do that? Or why would that not be a good idea? Okay, so the patch would shrink because it hasn't been worn, right? And that's the point that Jesus is going to talk about. But what else? Okay, all right, so it's not malleable, so I could, if I patched over and then I twisted a certain way or moved a certain way, it wouldn't bend with the garment, right? What else? It's plain. It's a plain thing, so don't think too hard. The color. The color. You can always tell a patch, right? Unless you're using a piece, and you're a skilled seamstress, but you're using a piece that matches. Okay, so there's a little bit about the cloth that we can maybe understand. The wine is more interesting, I think, and it's what a lot of people focus on. It's so funny, when you read in the Old or New Testament about wine, the first thing people want to ask is about the consumption of alcohol. I don't think that's the point of this parable at all, and so we ain't going to talk about it that way. But we do need to understand how wine was made in the 1st century. Wine was as common for them as drinking a Coke is for us, and that's all we're going to say about it. On the, what would that be, the left-hand side, this is an archaeological discovery of a wine press. And of course, all you have are the vats and the tubs. So that square piece in the back is where you would put the grapes. And over it, as you see in the picture on the right, over it would be this wood, rafter of some sort with rope or chain hanging off of it so you don't fall. And you would literally press the grapes. You would stomp on them with your feet, and the grape juice would run down into this vat, which would be the one on the bottom, towards the bottom of the screen, and you see it in the illustration here. Now, the one thing about the illustration that is not entirely correct is the clay pots. Now, what's the problem with the clay pots? They were used, but what's the problem with using a clay pot with the fermentation process of wine? It's the same problem as using old wineskins. Right. So when you're pressing that wine, it doesn't come out ready to drink as wine. It comes out as, Diet Welch's. Okay? So you have to wait for the fermentation process. When wine ferments, it expands. And so if you put that grape juice straight out of the grape into a clay pot or into an old wineskin, as it ferments and expands, it will burst. It'll bust. And so that's why Jesus says you'll lose both the skin and the wine, because now there's a hole in it, it's leaked out, and it's gone, right? You've lost your wineskin, you've lost your wine. Okay. Wineskins were made typically from the neck of a goat or a sheep, and they were very common in the first century. Imagine a canteen, right? That's how people would travel, was with those skins. And you could have more than wine. You use it for carrying water or whatever, although water wasn't purified in the way that we think of now. And so people usually carried around things like wine. But whatever the case is, that skin, you call it a skin for a reason. What's leather? Leather is the hide, the skin of an animal, right? And so when that leather gets dry and old, it gets hard, okay? That's the same principle. It's exactly the same as what we're talking about here. Now, the new wineskins would still be malleable, right? They could expand with the wine. And that's what people wanted when they were making wine, was for it to expand so you don't lose the wine, you don't lose the skin. Now, that gives us then the historical context. The literary context is more important in this situation. Now, in other situations, like I keep going back to prodigal son, when the prodigal son is with the pigs, we need to know about the Jewish history in order to understand the message that's being spoken there, right? We don't necessarily have to know about the fermentation process of wine to figure out what's happening here, although it helps. So what's going on in the literary context? When I read this passage in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what does the structure of the paragraph say? So a literary context is like a cone. You start small, you get bigger, you get bigger, you get bigger. So we start sometimes with one single word or with one single verse. And then we get a little bigger to the paragraph, and then a little bit bigger to the chapter, and then a couple of chapters, and then the whole book, and then the entire New Testament, and then the entire Bible, right? So you grow rather than shrink when you study the literary context. This parable comes after the disciples of John asked Jesus why his disciples don't fast. Now, we didn't mention this with the historical context, but we need to mention it here. The disciples of John and the Pharisees have very little in common. Very little. The Pharisees, although not significant in the temple, that would be the Sadducees, but the Pharisees still operate under the temple guidelines. And so the Pharisees had figured out, they'd taken the law of Moses and they had written commentaries about the law of Moses, because the law of Moses sometimes prescribes things and then doesn't tell you how to do it. Case in point, Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. The text says, on this day you will afflict yourselves. Now you tell me what it means to afflict yourselves on the Day of Atonement. It's pretty broad, isn't it? I mean, am I supposed to beat myself? Am I supposed to cut myself? Am I supposed to fast? Am I supposed to walk barefoot in the snow? I mean, what am I supposed to do? Well, the Pharisees read that and they said, well, when you afflict yourself, everybody can afflict themselves by being hungry, and so it's a day of fasting. So the Day of Atonement, even today, is a time of fasting. Do no work on the Sabbath day. Well, how do I know if I'm working or not? Right? And so we get these things in Mishnah text, like if you're walking outside your house and you see a stick and you pick it up and put it on the windowsill, that is work. If you're inside your house and you're walking and you see a stick and you pick it up and put it on the windowsill, that is not work. Right? So the Pharisees had gotten so meticulous with how to keep the law, they had let their traditions come in and override the law. Right? So Jesus and His disciples are walking through a field of grain and they pluck the heads of grain and eat it on the Sabbath. Right? According to the tradition of the Pharisees, that's work and you are sinning. Okay? So the question about them fasting extends beyond Leviticus 16. The Pharisees fasted on Mondays and Thursdays. Every week, Mondays and Thursdays. Many of you know I wrote my master's thesis on fasting. And I was amazed to find, this is from Matthew chapter 6, verse 16 through 18. Because Jesus says, when you fast, don't do it like the hypocrites. And one of my questions was, who are the hypocrites? Well, Jesus calls in Matthew's gospel the Pharisees hypocrites, right? Well, what did the Pharisees do when they fasted? They literally put on makeup to make themselves look like they had fasted longer than they had. Okay? So, there's the Pharisees. Now, disciples of John. The disciples of John were not really, what would we say? I don't want to say they weren't dedicated to the temple, but they had problems with the temple. Can anyone maybe guess why they had problems with the temple as it was during the time of Jesus? Who built the temple during the time of Jesus? Herod the Great, right? Who was it that John the Baptist spoke out against? It was not Herod the Great, but it was Herod the Great's sons, right? Now I get all the Herods confused, but it was all of them. Now, fasting was often done because you were upset about something. It was a time of prayer. It was a time of meditation. It was a time of seeking God's counsel and God's wisdom. And so it's interesting that the text in all these accounts tell us that it was the Pharisees and the disciples of John fasting at the same time. That doesn't necessarily mean they were fasting for the same reason. And many commentators believe the disciples of John were fasting because John is in prison and they're trying to fast and pray so that he'll be released. Now we know that he's not going to be released, he's going to be beheaded. But the Pharisees are fasting as part of the law of Moses as they perceived it. Okay, there's more historical context. Okay, fasting is often connected to intense sorrow and prayer. Now, the interesting thing is, people will look at this passage and they'll say, well, right there, Jesus says that you don't need to fast. No, because in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus uses the phrase, when you, not if you. And those are two different words in English and in Greek. Okay? When you fast. The expectation was that fasting was going to be something that you were going to do. So why would somebody fast? Well, the issue here is not about fasting, but the occasion for fasting. Jesus tells them the reason that my disciples aren't fasting is because we are in an occasion that doesn't call for it. So what does Jesus say to the disciples of John when they ask the question? He says, my disciples can't fast while the bridegroom is with them. Okay, there, Jesus does two things. First of all, he says, it's a time for a party. Okay, it's time for a party. In their day, marriages lasted a week. The marriage celebration lasted a week. It was a feast every day. You would not dare fast at a wedding, right? That would be, I wouldn't put it past somebody to do this in today's culture, but that would almost be like shooting off streamers and fireworks at a funeral. The occasion just doesn't fit, right? At least for most people it doesn't. So the literary context here shows that the occasion didn't call for fasting. Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners and after the call of Levi or Matthew. You see that in Matthew's Gospel. And so that may have something to do with it as well, because he's eating with people that most people would say he doesn't need to eat with. We talked about the Pharisees fasting on Mondays and Thursdays. No need to talk about that again. Oh, the second thing Jesus does when he calls himself a bridegroom, he equates himself with God. In the Old Testament, what is God's relationship to Israel? He is Israel's what? Husband. He's Israel's husband. Okay? You can see this particularly in the prophecies of Hosea and Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 3 is one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the entire Bible, because God says, I am going to divorce Israel. Write her a certificate of divorce. You can only do that if you're married. Okay? So, in the Old Testament, God is also called Father, but He's not called Father very much. That comes more so in the New Testament, because you have Jesus the Son, and we are in Christ, and therefore God is our Father because we're in Christ. So when Jesus says, I'm the bridegroom, His hearers would be hearing Him equating Himself with God. And do you remember in the prophets, in the books of the prophets, when the day of the Lord came, that it was going to be a great and terrible day, but do you remember what happened after the day of the Lord came? There's the marriage supper. And John, the apostle, will draw on that in the book of Revelation, the marriage supper of the Lamb. Okay, so in the Old Testament, we talk about garments, and let's see, do I have garments on here? I don't think so. I may have it on another slide. Yeah, okay. Part of the challenge for us is we're over 2,000 years removed from these cultures, and so when we read these things, we look at them in different ways. When Jesus speaks of new wine, now garments are also part of the Old Testament and the allusion to the new covenant in the Old Testament. We'll see that here in just a minute. But wine is an important symbol in the Old Testament. It's incredibly important. I'll give you a couple of examples here. You can look at these and write them down. We don't have time to go to all of them. Covenantal blessings, agricultural prosperity, joy and celebration, restoration, salvation, messianic abundance. Now, one other that I would mention here is when the children of Israel, the second generation, were getting ready to go into the promised land, right? Numbers chapter 13, and the spies come back, they're carrying what? Grapes. What kind of grapes? Absolutely, yeah, the massive cluster of grapes. That is not because they liked a diet heavy of fruit. It's the abundance of wine, of land flowing with milk and honey, right? It's just the abundance of all the good things, okay? So wine symbolizes abundance, the abundant blessing of God. Jesus, when He institutes the Lord's Supper at the Passover, He says, take this cup, this is my blood of the new covenant. Right? My blood of the new covenant. What was in that cup? It was wine. Right? In the Passover, that wine was symbolic of the blood of the Lamb. Now, with Jesus, that wine is symbolic of the blood of the new covenant that Jeremiah prophesies about in Jeremiah 31 through 33. Now, we mentioned that everything in a parable represents something. Okay? Now, notice it says option 1. We're going to have option 2 in just a minute. I was telling Cody earlier that It's very frustrating biblical study sometimes because you do all this study and you get your PowerPoint ready and you know what you're going to say, and then at 1:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, whenever you leave the office at 2, you read something that totally undoes everything you thought you knew. So that's what we're going to deal with tonight. Okay, this is the traditional view. This is what 99.9% of people, if we were to read it in our context and our understanding, would say this parable represents. The unstruck cloth and the new wine both represent the new covenant. Isaiah 61:10, Zechariah 3:1-7 speak of this garment, this changing of the garment, this new garment as a symbol of the new covenant. Zechariah 3, I wrote a paper about this, and it's been one of my favorite topics recently. It's the vision of Joshua the high priest. He's clothed in dirty garments, right? And God says, change your clothes. The angels come, they strip him of those clothes, they put on new priestly garments, and then God gives him a condition. As long as you follow the statutes and laws that I have instituted, you can continue to be high priest. But the second that you don't, you're out. Okay? So, they're a symbol of clothing as representing something new. I'm 1,000% convinced that this is what Paul has in mind in Galatians chapter 3, verse 27, when he says that when you're baptized into Christ, you put on Christ. It's being clothed in the new covenant. New wine, we talked about that just a minute ago. There's some other passages if you want those. Now, the tear, right? The tear that is worse. You take a piece of unshrunk cloth, put it on a new garment, and it tears. I don't just have the tear that needed patched. I have now the tear that needed patched and a new tear, right? One that will require more sewing, more patching, whatever. What does the worst tear represent? What's the question about that Jesus offers this parable as an answer to? What's the question? Why don't your disciples fast? Fasting is never commanded in the law of Moses. The Pharisees said that it was for the Day of Atonement, but the Day of Atonement only said to afflict yourselves. It doesn't say to fast. And fasting is practiced in the law of Moses, or in the Old Testament. So, isn't it interesting that sometimes our traditions can become as binding as Scripture? Well, what happens if I have something new, like Jesus, like the new covenant, and I try to make Jesus fit with everything I think I know? What's going to happen? The two are not going to mesh as well as I want them to. This was the problem with the Galatians. Read the book of Galatians. What's Paul asking there? Or what is he answering? He's answering, how Jewish do I have to be Christian? Because the Galatians were making people get circumcised, they were making people obey the food laws, they were making people follow the Sabbath. And Paul says, look, Jesus came, fulfilled the law, and made the law obsolete. You cannot put Him in the same category as this. Okay, so there's the worst tear. The old garment and the old wineskins have been argued that they represent the old covenant. And so the destruction of the wine and the wineskin. Now this is important because with the cloth, we don't read about the destruction of the new cloth, right? Or the unshrunk cloth. But with the wine, we read about the destruction of the wine and the wineskin. So the restriction of tradition can make the new blessing unusable and the old implement worthless. If we try to be so wrapped up in tradition, we try to be so wrapped up in opinions of people, we can not only lose the basis on which those traditions are built, which is not always a bad thing, but we can lose the truth of the gospel. Okay? Now, that's option number one. Option number two is less intense. Option number 2 argues that the old garments and wineskins have value. Now, this is actually, I think, a good observation, because nowhere in the parable does the person who has the old garment or the old wineskin throw it away. Why does our Bible have 66 books in it? Not a trick question. Yes. Yes. We need the Old Testament to understand the New Testament. It is the wrong attitude that has been promoted throughout church history from the 2nd century to today. It is the wrong attitude to suggest that we do not need the Old Testament, or that the Old Testament doesn't mean what it says. Remember, Jesus is God. Who gave the law of Moses? God did. You cannot say that the law of Moses was incomplete or was not perfect, because God, true perfection, gave it. It is complete and it is perfect. Here's the problem with the law of Moses. I am not. I am not complete. I am not perfect. I cannot uphold the perfect standard of the law that God has laid for His people. And in God's grace, He knew that, He understood that, and so He sent the one who could, which is Himself, God incarnate, Jesus, to be the fulfillment of that law and thereby make the law obsolete. Jesus did not abolish the law. He fulfilled it and made it obsolete. That is very, very important. So, if these old garments represent the old covenant, might we say then that the Pharisees and the disciples of John had abused the old covenant with their legalism? Okay, I hate using the term legalism because that gets misconstrued, but I think you know what I mean. The worst tear should be avoided, not the patch itself. The new wine and the old wineskin should be preserved. That's the idea of the text. The old law has value, and the new law corresponds to the old if the restrictions don't make it worse. So, I'm going to skip ahead real quick. I think you guys get the meaning of the text, and we can go back if we have time. But this is a real problem in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 15, we have what's called the Jerusalem Council. Basically, there's a problem of, like we said with the Galatians, how Jewish do I have to be Christian? And so James and the apostles and Paul all meet together, and they say, verse 28, this is the letter. Read Acts 15 sometimes. We have a letter inside a document. So here's the formal letter, verse 22 through 29. Don't have time to read it all. Verse 28 says, "For it seemed good that to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these requirements, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell." So, Paul will write in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 1 Corinthians, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, eating meat sacrificed to idols. And Paul says, look, if it's not going to be a problem for your soul, go ahead. If it's going to cause somebody to stumble, don't do it. Right? But right here I have a letter from the apostles that says, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So in one passage I have a prohibition against it, in another passage I have allowance for it. Do we have a contradiction in Scripture? No. We have the fulfillment of new wine and old wineskins. By the way, old wineskins can be used to ferment wine. They just have to be made pliable. They have to be made moist. You have to do something to them. And a new cloth can go on an old garment, but it also has to be made pliable. Right? And so, the meaning of the passage, just real quick as we end. are these four things. Number one, fasting represented the rituals of the old law. By not fasting, Jesus' disciples were participating in a new covenant because the bridegroom was with them. So you don't need to be worried about the ritual of the old law whenever you have the instigator of the new law with you. Real quick, the old cloth and the old wineskin could receive what was new if care was taken. Jesus did not abolish the law but fulfilled it, making it obsolete, and the things that made one pious according to the old law would not measure up to the perfect blood of Christ. Now, how do we live this parable today? We are very careful about tradition, and we make sure that we have book, chapter, and verse of the whole Bible to make sure that we know what we believe. Okay, that's where we have to end, and it's good to see everybody tonight. Hope to see you all back on Sunday.